What I'm going to be doing today is really dealing specifically with the case study method in anthropology. And as I had mentioned before this talk began, I was actually a bit surprised to be given the last phrase, in anthropology, because I originally thought, goodness, is there any other way of doing it? Because I identify it so much with the kind of social science research that we do. In general in the social sciences. However, I think that it's actually an opportunity to be very clear-headed about the specificity of the work of developing the case study method, particularly in Manchester, and its special reference to the history of anthropology within this university. So my very first part of my talk will be about the historical origins and the context of the methodology with reference to the Manchester School of Anthropology. And then the next part of my talk will address the sort of the key points of what the case study method is in that legacy and in its extensions. The third part of my talk will undertake a case study from my own research that I think is it compares in interesting ways with the period of Gluckman's anthropology in the 50s, because I am dealing with post-independence Papua New Guinea, where he was dealing with pre-independence Africa, and I think that's an intriguing kind of comparison. And then I will finally discuss some other extensions of the case study method by other members of the university community more widely, most specifically within anthropology. So that's the general outline of what we're up to today. Now, there we are. In the historical origins or the context of this methodology, we have an overt commitment to the idea that it's an ethnographic method, which, like other ethnographic methods, is directed by participant observation and then later by inductive analysis. And it leads to general claims and to the opportunity to pose new questions. And I think one has to take those words very carefully, because it does not generate universal theories. And I want you to hold the idea in your mind that a general claim is not the same thing as universal theory. So through a process of working from the ground up, being able to make a generalization after having intensively worked through a series of events in a case analysis, an anthropologist working with a case study method is able to make a few generalizations and perhaps repose their questions. Now, in the business of defining the case study method, Max Gluckman looked back. And what I have in front of you here is a picture of a Kula trading canoe. And he used Malinowski as an inspiration. Malinowski was one of the forefathers of anthropology in Britain, as you know. He also did his principal research in the area of the world that I actually have inherited as my ethnographic region. And Malinowski's simple study of the Kula ring in the Trobriand Islands of Papua New Guinea could be seen as a key example of an early effort at a case study, simply because it's situated in one place, dealing with one specific question. Malinowski's question was, what is wealth? Such that people would build canoes and travel 200 miles across dangerous seas in order to be able to exchange luxury items with each other. And so the question of what is wealth then actually drove that case study. And it's a very big question if you take very seriously the business of thinking that wealth is not simply a shell or a pig or the currency that we pass around. So he was able to pose some very interesting questions about the very nature of economy itself. Now, Max Gluckman realized that in a post-colonial world, different than the one that Malinowski was working in, that people are actually joined together in conflict within a shared social system. Whereas Malinowski was looking for alternative worldviews or other worldviews, Gluckman posed the possibility that we have to take very seriously as anthropologists that a shared system is a proper subject for anthropological study, because human beings inhabit the same shared social system and because they share the possibility of talking to each other in a coherent way across that alleged divide. Yet he recognized that this is an intractable situation, because even as much as people share the same world, they are often in conflicted relationships with each other, and in fact they may be joined through their conflict. And it's that tension between conflict and enjoyment or sharing that he's always working, and hence the subject of anthropology is somewhat obdurate. As opposed to the Kula trading boat, we have here African laborers crossing a lake. All right, we can see that people in Gluckman's world are involved in movement for the purposes of finding economic well-being in other ways than Malinowski imagined, and yet the big questions of what is wealth and what is the circumstance in which it's created persist. Gluckman proposed that his study then had to start from a different methodological orientation. And if we were going to have a better understanding of the African settlement, the place where the laborers arrived and began to work, or the place that they returned to at the end of the day in order to, make a decent life, it had to pursue a different approach than what had been working in the previous two generations of research in Africa. And so he distinguished himself from his contemporary, Meyer Fortes, who had very effectively laid out the idea of African tribal structures by focusing on genealogical systems, and was focused very tightly on notions of political leadership that ensued from kinship relations. Different from Fortes, Gluckman drew on Evans Pritchard, who at the center of his study of kinship had put the problem of conflict into the mix, whereas Fortes, focusing on continuities and leadership, had not made conflict so central to the understanding of even kinship structures itself. And in this sense, I think if you see this picture from Evans Pritchard, what you can identify is a series of different clans. This is collected in the 1930s, just so you can locate it. And Gluckman is responding to this and with this. Those clans are in conflict or in feuding relationships with each other, and yet they see themselves as being conjoined within one broader social geopolitical system. What was interesting to Evans Pritchard is that they were able to control a vast territory through maintaining conflictive kin relationships, so that they established themselves as a largely populous group within a major region on the basis of conflict and similarity amongst them. Now, Gluckman began to think very seriously about the nature of conflict and the feud itself. And in focusing on the feud, he decided that, in fact, the point of entry was no longer the genealogy, but the point of entry into any study had to be the point of conflict, the event of conflict itself. And ultimately, he realized that if he was going to understand something like the African town, it was necessary to think about where different events in everyday life became most resonant with broader social structural contradictions of people's existence. All right? And in this, then, he indirectly made it possible for anthropology to have a kind of voice in the movement to independence by pointing out that in those moments of conflict, in those times of analysis, in those times it was possible to show that people were quite reasonable about what they desired and what they were able to do, and this became reasonable grounds for putting forward evidence that independence was completely viable, that people were able to manage their own lives. This was not about a story of somebody living in an alternative world that was not able to be self-governing. Okay. Now, he was able to deal with visual contradictions that presented themselves to the eye in the 1950s, where the symbols of legitimacy were being used in various ways, and ultimately the case study method actually came to the forefront in order to deal with the vagaries and with the ambiguities of the kind of time that he was working in. This slide is a bit rich with information, and I'm going to pause on it for a minute, because having given you some sense of where Gluckman was coming from, I think it's important to take a little bit longer to think about what the case study was in his hands. And it actually has three different faces, which are also three different stages of its development. As I've already said, Gluckman saw the case study method as a way of getting at deep structural contradictions in everyday life. And so for him, that was the broader situation in which the people that he wished to illuminate for his readership were involved in. That deeper structure of conflict informed the situation in the broadest sense. And it's possible to access that situation in the broadest sense through a series of different conflicts that he analyzes as a sequence of events. It's a matter of some concern in a series of different writers to try and clarify these different forms of the case study method. And it's, in a certain amount of debate between Gluckman and his students that they start to tease out the idea of situational analysis, different from an extended case study. As I've already hinted at, an extended case study might be approached to the study of the situation over a longer period of time, and that the situation of conflict is only illuminated by looking at a series of different events, each one a discrete case study, but in the bigger picture becomes what Gluckman later calls an extended case study. I believe it was Elizabeth Colson who was the person who really pioneered this. And those people who worked with the extended case study had enormous amount of research experience behind them, and it's probably very effective to make the claims for what you can understand about the social situation through extended case studies, because there's a kind of temporal depth and a kind of experiential deftness with the situation, and at the same time, there's also the limits of it, because not everybody is able to carry out an extended case study. When we speak about long-term research, we're talking about people who've repeatedly returned to field work over a decade. And so the virtues of an extended case study actually require quite a bit of hard graft on the part of an anthropologist to be, if they're ever to be realized. Nevertheless, most people remained in the Manchester School to be serious about the situating of the case study in the midst of an analysis of conflict itself. And even in its most late transformation in what was called the social drama, the dynamics of social life remained the entry point to any particular analysis. It's Victor Turner who makes the social drama the feature of the case study method, because he became more interested in the expressive components of the case study. He's more interested in what people used, what people said, and how they used symbols in order to express their understanding of the tensions that they were living and the conflicts that they were involved in. And so for him, the case study became an opportunity to see the way in which people reflected upon those conflicts and presented their lives as a kind of drama that they were living in at that very moment. It's this particular mode of case study method that I think quite a few anthropologists have innovated upon in more recent years. And yet, as I come to some of the work that's being done contemporarily in Manchester by anthropologists, I'm surprised just how many people are still working within the situational analysis and the extended case study too. So I would hesitate to see that this is like the last transformation and the ultimate point that the case study method comes to, because it's actually quite effective for doing quite a few things. Now, one anthropologist, Bruce Kapfura, has tried to mix the case study method with social network analysis. And in order to understand the case better in the African town, he simply started tracing out the relationships between people within any given event. And in the course of sort of retracing those relationships, he's been able to create something of a rhythm or a prism of information. For him, this became just a bit of a mental map of the complexity of relationships that the case study method was able to access. And that becomes the starting point for his piece of writing, which follows from that. If I were to sum up what I've just said and some key points about what distinguishes this case study method, they would probably come down to about three things. One, and I've started at the very beginning with this, that you have to assume that the anthropologist and all the people involved in the case study are inhabiting a shared social system and are enjoined in it by conflict. And then secondly, it's often assumed that the kind of reasoning in which people are involved in when they're engaged in a particular event, or when they are addressing the fact of their relatedness in this situation, is often contradictory and often apparently irrational in the first case. And this presents a particular kind of problem to Gluckman, because he wants to point out for us that if we're to understand the kind of moral and even legal reason that is being used to sort through case studies, or to sort through people's experiences of specific events, then it requires that we recognize that the very nature of that reason is in itself contradictory, and that is what people work with. And here is where he's showing us that he is at no point going to reach for any kind of universal truth or any kind of universal law that can be taken from the case study. He's only able to give us some general comments on about what we can say about people's understanding of their own experience. He, he rather brilliantly, I think, identifies a concept from common law in the notion of the reasonable person, or at his time, reasonable man. And it's a particularly useful one for dealing with the circumstances that he's looking at, because the concept of reasonable man embodies in legal work the form of moral reason that embraces conflict and does not seek to resolve contradictions. If we were to, I'll just move ahead to that point because each of these slides say exactly what I've just said in longer form. The concept of the reasonable person is actually really quite useful here. It comes from English common law, and it is used to measure a person's actions when in any situation where one is trying to establish a duty of care. Now, many of the conflicts that Gluckman studies actually are pertinent to this kind of question. He is looking at a period of time in Africa with the movement towards independence when people are trying to understand, should we deal with this as a criminal act? Should we deal with this as something that is reasonable to do when we're confronted with acts of violence around a development project? How do we recognize who is responsible for the creation of the unpleasantness, right? What is the duty of care that is held up for measure when when a colonial administration fails to adequately service the village by building an adequate bridge, right? There's quite a number of important issues that he's actually grappling with, and so by extending the measure of the reasonable person to the African situation, he's actually challenging the colonial administration to look at customary law in the same light as which they look at common law, right? And say that this principle of reasonable man is actually extendable to all circumstances which one encounters anywhere in the world. Why? Because we're living in a shared world, because we're living in a shared social system. And in his work in doing this, he's able to show that the case study method actually enables the anthropologist and those people working with him to come to a fair-minded judgment about what would a reasonable person do in this situation. There's nothing about the reasonable person that is a measure of universal wisdom or universal rationality. It is about what should a reasonable person in this particular circumstance do as a matter of good judgment. In case study law, they very famously talk about the Clapham bus, and the idea that if you were to say who is a reasonable person or who's a reasonable man and what would they reasonably do, let's create an imaginary circumstance on the bus on Clapham Junction, and what would somebody who was just a rider on the bus do, right? So for Gluckman, that was a completely reasonable way of talking about how does one talk about a duty of care and reasonable action within a given situation in Africa in his time. Now, in order to understand how it works, I think it's important to sort of take this idea of the case study and locate it very firmly in social science analysis, distinguishing it against how it's used in law and in psychoanalysis versus, say, for example, in a museum display case, different ways that people have played with case studies in subsequent years. It really does bear some relationship to legal studies and some relationship to psychoanalysis. One in relationship to law because of the history of uses from common law into customary law, and secondly in psychoanalysis because of its deep concern with judgment and the nature of human knowledge and consciousness. But what it's most successful at doing is in helping to understand the way in which conflict constitutes rather than divides social life, and that the work of the case study method then helps to access the nature of the event itself. And this takes us more firmly into the area of social sciences and away from this specialist or expert knowledge of law and psychology and into the business of understanding social life. in anthropology, or perhaps in history, the case study method has been used. I know that medieval historians have extended the use of the case study method rather well into the study of rebellions in their period. And it's a way of engaging with the nature of social life in a more dialectical and sort of more interested way in the lived process of life. But if we were to ask what kind of knowledge does the case study convey, it's more useful in expressing the way in which consciousness becomes concrete, and less useful for thinking about some of the ways in which we might abstract from lived experience. So as a method, what the case study does is point to details of life as they are expressions of people's beliefs, rather than point to the way in which one can abstract a concept out of people's experience, if that makes a clear distinction. What kind of evidence does a case study deploy? Well, most generally, a case study works from the specific to the general, and in working from the specific to the general, they more often identify themselves with the legacy of Aristotelian science. When I say that, sort of in parentheses, general to the specific, is because the questions that they ask are often about how one conceives of specific problems. For example, what is a duty of care? What is reasonable action? Who has political authority? And these are the kinds of general questions that move people to pursue the specific analysis that leads to the possibility of reframing the general nature of the understanding that they're seeking. And so in that sense, it's a dialectical kind of exercise. If it helps mostly, I think, to take on this business of the case study is probably to give you a bit of an insight into how one works. And in this one, I wanted to turn to a piece of my own work. Does that sound like it's a good plan? Okay. I want to turn to a piece of my own work, and over the next 6 slides, I'm going to outline a case study from Papua New Guinea that bears a bit of relationship to the kinds of concerns that Gluckman had. If I hadn't mentioned it already, Gluckman's research in Africa, in South Africa, Botswana area, was principally conducted in what was known as the African Copper Belt of the 1950s and 60s, an area of mineral exploitation. And this particular case study takes me to the island of Bougainville, where in the 1980s and 90s, the local residents closed down what was then the world's largest copper mine. And in this one case study, I'm interested in a principal issue of what is the duty of care and who has the duty of care towards children in that state of crisis. So here we have the Bougainvillean children. In about 2003, after the worst of the violence is over, but the problem still remains of who has the responsibility for rebuilding the social services in the country. And I'll take you through just what happened so you know how we're sort of coming to this particular problem. It was in '89 that in an act of anti-corporate violence that the Papua New Guineans in South Bougainville destroyed the heavy machinery for the operations of the open pit copper mine. And it's a mine that's sort of distantly related to us, if you want to think genealogically. Rio Tinto was the parent company of an Australian company, which was the parent company of the Bougainvillean Copper company, Bougainvillean Copper, who was the company operating on the island. And in the aftermath of the explosion and the leaving of the expatriates, the Papua New Guinean Defence Force takes control. And the government of Papua New Guinea embargoed trade and services in the immediate year following. This happened like in November, December, and then in January they stopped all trade between Bougainville and the rest of Papua New Guinea and the rest of the world. And this meant that anyone who was still present in the island of Bougainville who was not Bougainvillean was asked to leave as well. Within a short period of time, schools and hospitals were shut, and it was said people went back to the jungle. And there were bans on radio transmissions, so that it became a kind of blackout area for the world, so that no one really knew what was going on there. A few photographs come out that were sent from that time. This is a young man who has been part of the group who actually closed the mine and has now gone to the jungle in order to sort of hide out from the presence of the Papua New Guinean army. No doubt this brings a certain amount of international criticism. As much as the Papua New Guinean government tried to close down on the events, there was enough people who had left the island to say that this was a situation that needed a certain amount of attention. Some of the middle-class Bougainvilleans who had chosen to leave at the time the services shut down actually saw themselves become activists in Port Moresby and in Australia and in other points abroad. And with their reports to Amnesty International and the United Nations that they exposed some of the atrocities by the PNG army, they also began the process of demanding the reinstatement of social services, and international groups argued that the crisis was evidence of the failure of democratic government. And here there was a situation developing where a crisis of legitimacy certainly laid out the matter of concern with something had to be done in order to restore legitimate government within the country of Papua New Guinea and within the island of Bougainville itself. Just as emblematic of the kind of publicity that the expatriates and others managed to generate and the ways in which they did it, you know, what sort of this chap with the shirt and the lament for the failure of his province. In response to public criticism, the national government of Papua New Guinea decided to reinstate the services. They did it prematurely, and the members of the local villages actually rejected the arrival of the new teachers and new medics, so they had to leave, and it took a little bit longer to reinstate the services they desired. In the course of doing that, in an absolutely desperate moment, Sir Julius Chen, then Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea, hired an international mercenary troop called Sandline Incorporated, who actually were Persian Gulf veterans. And before they actually executed the plan that they had written, there was a coup of the Papua New Guinean government, and the mercenary plan was scuttled. Now, in the military coup, which follows, they actually replaced the national government through a democratic election, and in '97 they begin the business of reinstating social services again, because they're so centrally now on the world stage that they feel that there's a question of bearing some responsibility for the delivery of care to the children and to the families on Bougainville. And again, government civil servants return to rebuild. They're welcomed this time by the islanders, who have more confidence now that their interests are being met and that there are no threats of mercenary soldiers backing up the delivery of the aid as there had been in the first case. And the government of Papua New Guinea actually fails now to pay their own citizens who they've sent to deliver the social services. They say it's simply they have no budget for it. And in this case, where the aid workers, Papua New Guinean aid workers and employees of the government are trying to rebuild hospitals and rebuild schools, they are necessarily billeted into the homes of Bougainvillean villagers because they have no other means of feeding themselves. Their paychecks aren't there. And in the business of experiencing sort of more intimate day-to-day relationships, they become confronted in a face-to-face way with the tragedy of the situation. The Bougainvilleans ask them to think about how in heaven's name are we going to ever deliver healthcare and education to the younger generation of children who've now been a decade without school or proper medicine. Those Papua New Guineans who were present in Bougainville arranged to adopt the Bougainvillean children formally and return them to their home villages out of province of Bougainville, where they actually have access to those services outside. Now, it's an unusual thing, because to adopt a child from the hands of their parents under circumstances of crisis creates all kinds of sort of interesting legal problems. But they do it anyway, and the men who take them back to their home islands are principally organizing the adoptions from the clans of Bougainvillean children to the clans of their own wives. These are matrilineal societies, so a man doesn't adopt a child into his own clan, he adopts it into his wife's clan on her behalf. And one could ask, why was the idea necessary? This is the photograph of the delivery of health care just on the island immediately north of Bougainville, which was being very heavily stressed because people were moving there. Sorry, I slept sort of out of step there. So the fathers of, the new adoptive fathers bring the Bougainvillean children back to their home villages. And it's an extraordinarily heroic act. And one is pressed to ask, who exactly had the duty of care here? Who is responsible for delivering the social services? And how do we understand the nature of the series of decisions that were made? Are these reasonable decisions, in fact? Now, you could ask, is there a duty of care borne by the state to provide basic social services to a strife-torn region? The world stage, interested in human rights, said yes. All right? Is there a duty of care carried by individuals employed to deliver social services? So the school teachers, the medics who were there to rebuild hospitals and school, shouldered a duty of care that the state was being demanded, was being expected to deliver because of broader international criticism and in the interest of human rights, right? These individuals shouldered it. Do they see themselves as citizens in a crisis taking up a moral and legal responsibility? And should this be understood in terms of humanitarian response to crisis at all, or is it simply people doing what they must? Asking those questions about who has that duty of care makes us rethink basically just where does one understand where does one understand something like a duty of care where conflicts are where values are conflicted? How do we know the limits of responsibility for legal or moral infraction? And does examination of practice enable insight into ethical action at all? These are, I think, really big questions, but that's what excites me about the case study method, is that you can go into the minute, into the particular, and suddenly, in very concrete form, are faced with very, very big questions in the nature of social science and very big questions in the business of philosophy, of moral philosophy. And yet the answers probably still lie in the work of carrying through responsible social science itself. So here I am. What kind of questions can this case method answer? As I've said, it's best for raising new questions about shared knowledge and shared assumptions, and I've certainly got some new questions, having worked through that business of asking what is the duty of care, who is responsible for it. It aims for clarification or critique of concepts by introducing multiple perspectives on it. And yes, I think that by breaking down the series of questions about who is responsible or who has a duty of care here, I think we do have a clarification of the general concept of duty of care and what a reasonable person would do. And it demands the researcher documents in ethnographic detail itself, and that this provides us with some kind of legitimate understanding. And I can't move out of this case study successfully without returning to some aspect of the detail of people's experience of it in order to illuminate, what one can know from it. And in this way, I think that the case study method is a bit difficult to carry forward into other areas of work, because it requires that that the researcher and the reader has a commitment to working through to the end of the story. And not everyone is willing to do that, but in this case, it's pretty hard to argue against not listening to the end of it. In general, if I ask that question, what kinds of understandings does the case study give? Well, TMS Evan, reflecting on the nature of the case study method, says, well, look, really, this is kind of presaging practice theory, that by looking at situational analysis, we are given to understanding social action and how people embed their lives consciously with a series of decisions to act in specific ways. His colleague Handelman makes the point that the case study actually captures disparate accounts of life as a process, and that this is somehow or another a more appropriate way of understanding the ethnographic than any study that situates its knowledge in forms and relations alone. Now, Gregory makes the claim that the case study is particularly useful if we want to specify values and clarify concepts, because it's in their concrete forms that we can actually get a hold of what people mean by duty. right? And then Strathern makes the point of using the case study method more often for simply raising new questions. And we can certainly see how it does work that way. Some of the innovations on the methodology today, I've corresponded with Caroline Moser, who's working with a version of the case study method when she wants to think about the appraisal of poverty and violence in urban areas of Colombia, Jamaica, and Guatemala. And in her innovation, she has started to work with research assistants who are participating in the research, but also are members of the community who are suffering it. And in doing that, she is able to illuminate more successfully just what people mean by poverty, just what do they mean by the experience of violence, and by situating it within the community in which those researchers are members, then there's a kind of clarity and specificity for them as well. An entirely different kind of project by Alyssa Grossman in our department focused recently, this is a new PhD, on a case methodology that helped to grasp sort of the slippery ground of memory and nostalgia that lies between the sort of the history of the communist past as it's recalled in the post-communist present in Romania, and by focusing on how one recreates a meal by asking what do you remember about food in the communist era that you enjoyed or didn't enjoy, and then reconstructing the problem of making a meal in everyday life. She was able to deal with the slippages of memory that perhaps were like sweetly nostalgic and maybe more bitterly nostalgic, that wouldn't have been defined quite so well hadn't she not worked at this kind of methodology. And then several other of my colleagues have worked with case study method. Andrew Irving has tried this in the business of thinking about a personal life as a case method, in the case method way, thinking about a biography of the transition, the process of becoming someone who is an HIV sufferer. And so dealing with that as a case study allows him to illuminate that as an analysis of the movement to a particular social position, rather than simply a personal story. And Dick Werbner, who's been practicing anthropology for his entire life, for 40 years, has used the case study method repeatedly in many of his films about charismatic Christianity in South Africa. And this has culminated in a final analysis in his new book, Holy Hustlers, Schisms and Prophecy. But anyway, a further look at other studies in Manchester, I think, will reveal that there is an ongoing commitment to making conflict an entry point to the study of ethnography, and that the case study method, in some of its more recent innovative forms, actually still remains a viable part of that, the discipline's practice. And in a sense, I guess I'm not at all surprised when current evaluators of the case study method insist that this is actually the cornerstone of the Manchester School anthropological approach. There's, Evans and Handelman, if you pick up that particular review of the case study method that I've posted on the web, make a very compelling case that this really does describe what Gluckman and his students and the legacy that he left behind has given us. If there's a final word that I wanted to leave you with on the case study method, is that is driven really seriously by the problem of what is an ethnographic fact. And Max, reflecting on what one could do with facts, belittled Leach by saying, well, look, I believe it's fatal to become, like Leach, bored with ethnographic fact. And, I hope that I've demonstrated with the case study that this is certainly not a possibility. Thanks.